States Struggle to Provide Housing for Migrant Farm Workers by Teresa Wiltz, May 2nd, 2016, The Pew Charitable Trust. This article has been abridged for educational purposes. Go to the link to view the complete article. Every spring, a couple million migrant farm workers, mostly immigrants, many undocumented, jump from farm to farm, state to state to harvest the nation's crops. Given the transient nature of their work, most are dependent on scarce, often dilapidated temporary housing. Some workers live in employer-owned housing that is licensed and state-regulated, though even this may be in disrepair. Many live in unlicensed, hazardous labor camps, which are often owned by farmers. Rental housing is in short supply in rural areas, making it easy for landlords to charge exorbitant rents. Some farm workers sleep 10 to a trailer, bunk in barns, or camp in the woods. The unsanitary, crowded, and poorly ventilated living conditions pose risks to workers' health, increasing their vulnerability to everything from infectious disease to heat strokes. In a handful of states, efforts are underway to improve living conditions for these workers. Oregon offers tax credits to investors who build farm worker housing. In Oregon and Washington, nonprofits are building apartment complexes for farm workers using a combination of state and local money, federal funds, and private money. Substandard housing. Most migrant farm workers are immigrants from Mexico and Central America. Some hail from Jamaica and Haiti, and 1 in 4 is U.S. born. Most are men, their average age is 36. 41% of them are undocumented. California, Texas, Washington, Florida, Oregon, and North Carolina have the largest numbers of farm workers, according to the Student Action with Farm Workers, a Durham, North Carolina-based advocacy and research group. The lack of safe and sanitary housing for migrant farm workers has been a problem for decades, but recent investigations have shined a spotlight on the issue. In March, Texas state lawmakers from areas near the border pushed for more aggressive enforcement of the state's underfunded housing inspection program, after journalists found that farm workers were forced to live in unventilated shipping containers and relieve themselves in the brush. Migrant housing laws in Texas are fairly extensive, but the investigation found that the state agency had not fined a single farm owner for housing infractions since 2005. Meanwhile, an April report by the Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting found that oversight of migrant housing in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Missouri, Texas, and Wisconsin was fractured and ineffective. State inspectors found mold, sewage, pest infestations, and faulty electrical wiring in the farm worker housing, but rarely followed up to ensure that conditions improved. Farm workers are often reluctant to speak up, particularly if they are undocumented, said Moises Loza, executive director of the Housing Assistance Council, a Washington, D.C.-based low-income housing development agency. When you work for a grower and he owns the housing, you better be careful, said Loza, the son of migrant workers. Not only could you lose your job, but you've lost your housing. That clearly adds to the fear factor. Employer-owned migrant housing is subject to federal and state regulations that mandate minimum housing standards for temporary farm labor. Sufficient heat, running water, adequate bathroom and kitchen facilities, clean and safe buildings with enough bed space, far enough apart. but lax enforcement is common, according to housing rights experts such as Eileen Jacobs, director of the Litigation for California Rural Legal Assistance Incorporation. Furthermore, federal agencies can have conflicting housing standards. For example, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration requires that housing in temporary labor camps maintain at least 100 square feet living space per person, while the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development defines overcrowding as anything less than 165 square feet per person. California efforts. California started building migrant housing centers in the 1960s. Before then, farm workers were forced to camp out by riverbeds, in cars, and in dwellings with no indoor plumbing, said Evan Gerberding with the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Today, Gerberding's agency operates 24 housing centers scattered around the state. The counties own the land, but the state owns the actual buildings. Families live in small air-conditioned housing from April to October and pay about $11 to $12.50 per day in rent. The centers also have laundry facilities, and many also offer daycare, medical and dental care, and English classes. But the migrant housing centers only serve families, which make up a small fraction of the state's migrant workers. The majority of farm workers, single men, aren't eligible to live there. And as the farming industry has changed, the centers aren't doing enough to keep up with the growing demand for housing, Jacobs said. For example, the industry increasingly operates nearly year-round, but the centers shut down for several months. I'm not criticizing the state for having the housing centers. It's just not nearly enough, Jacobs said.